Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Adam Golas, Marketing and Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I want to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. So please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we'll make them available on our website. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Marie-Louise instructor at OLBM. Marie-Louise specializes in training technical communicators in data authoring and customer experience know-how with an emphasis on usability and minimalism. With 2 decades in technical communication, Marie-Louise has extensive experience in applying information development best practices in various industries such as aircraft, pharma, IT, telecom, and EU institutions across continental Europe. In 2017, she was included in the 200 Outstanding Content Experience Strategists list. Without further ado, welcome Marie-Louise.
Hello from the heart of Europe. We have a gray sky and 10 degrees Celsius, which should be 50 degrees Fahrenheit in Brussels. These are good conditions to spend some time with DITA. Your company produces high quality documentation, but it's at the cost of poor production processing. In your team, the suggestion to switch to DITA has popped up. This change might have an impact on your documentation budget. How to explain it to your boss and get your DITA budget approved? Let's team up and join forces to be highly convincing. Next slide. First question, why do we want to switch to DITA? This will be followed by content reuse, where we'll examine applications, cost savings, copy and paste, and some examples. Showing how it works together with the phases of reuse could be of interest to the boss. He loves the fact sheet example. Hot discussions will probably emerge during the stakeholders meeting. But everybody will turn speechless when we talk about reuse figures. Next slide, please. First of all, why do you want to take the pain to switch to DITA? Would you mind answering this poll? Adam, please send the poll. Here we are. Perhaps one of the most heard arguments is it's trendy. Or maybe your marketing manager is interested in meeting Mrs. Dieter von Thies.
So with about half the attendees voting right now, Marie-Louise, we have 92% saying we want to implement content reuse.
Ah, okay.
So, oh, now it's jumped up. We'll give it a couple more seconds. Right now, with about 73% of the attendees voting, it has said 75. We'll give it 10 more seconds, and then I'll close the poll.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to close it. And right now, how everyone voted was 84% voted we want to implement content reuse. 8% said my team is bored of working with MS Word.
Oh, yeah.
And 5% saying my competitors are working in DITA. And 3% saying our marketing managers find Miss DITA I already closed it out. Miss DITA wants to say attractive. I forgot what it was with the photo.
Okay. Yeah. Next slide, please. Yes. Can you click further here? Reuse. Reuse is the main point. And for Michael Priestley, Adam, could you click further to display the other points? For Michael Priestley, the father of DITA, the sole objective of DITA is reuse. Exactly speaking, scalable reuse of information in terms of your customer need. What does this mean for authors? Next slide, please. Exactly speaking, scalable reuse in terms of needs. What does this mean for the authors? It's a promise to free authors from error-prone tasks and from mastering the find and replace mechanism. Next slide, please. And it's also a matter of customer experience. For us authors, DITA means going beyond frustrating copy and paste. And it's using our smart brain to produce excellent, efficient documentation that's worth reusing. How do we practice content reuse? Next slide, please. We can reuse, for example, for the same product, a machine overview in the operator's manual, in the slideshow for training classes, in the maintenance manual, etc. For the same product, but for different audiences, pre-sales, post-sales, including international customers. For similar products, 80% of the machine A operating procedures will be reused in the machine B operator's manual because the main operations are similar. For the same product, but in different format, such as web pages or responsive HTML to be displayed on mobile, or a PDF document, a Twitter message, or even a chatbot conversation. But at the end of the day, what does this mean for our management? Why should they be interested in reuse? Next slide, please. This is presumably the best argument for selling DITA to your boss. DITA saves money because it frees technical writers from highly time-consuming formatting tasks and from reproducing the same type of information. It's a matter of dramatically reducing content development costs. Additionally, implementing DITA often means improving the quality of the final documentation. It helps reduce errors. In short, DITA is good for production processes and outcomes. Next slide, please. Now, how do you want to explain the benefits of DITA and content reuse? Getting into technical details won't work. Your manager is not interested in conrefs. Let's start with explaining the difference between copy and paste and reuse. Next slide, please. Everyone in the management team is a great practitioner of a Control-C and Control-V. Let's think of marketing managers, and in particular proposal managers, who are copying boilerplate content in each of their bids. But let's remember, copying and pasting means losing time in useless formatting tasks and spreading errors in all documentation pieces. Errors? Which errors? Look at this car bug in Microsoft Word. If we want to prevent such formatting disaster, we'd better skip Word and do it in the DITA way. By the way, this bug usually displays when your 400-page user guide is almost ready to ship. This won't happen in DITA because you don't copy and paste a topic, but you reuse without modifying it a piece of information. Let's see an example of harmful copy and paste. Next slide, please. Let's take this example of poor content reuse as we see it in the aircraft industry. It's a so-called Hamburg crosswind landing incident. The pilot had to face strong, stormy crosswinds. Although he followed the procedure, the aircraft almost scraped a wing on the runway. Airbus aircraft demonstrated a behavior that had not been clearly described in standard documentation. Was the documentation really faulty? Next slide, please. The crucial information was about wind speed and the crab landing technique. The problem with the documentation was a flagrant lack of consistency. Someone in the documentation team was smart enough to provide the right wind speed value for the critical landing in one briefing note. But the tech writer didn't think of updating all manuals and guides where this procedure and figures were mentioned. Writing the correct wind speed values in one DITA topic would have been the solution, provided the topic had been marked as to reuse in all other flight operating manuals. This is another huge benefit of DITA. Reuse means consistency and safety. Next slide, please. Let's recap. DITA is content reuse. It also prevents inconsistency. Up to now, we have clarified the definition of content reuse and made the difference between content reuse and copy and paste. We also showed how topic reuse increases consistency and safety. Now, apart from this landing example, where can we apply other reuse policies? Next slide, please. In the preparation phase, cost savings come from the formatting phase. Working in MS Word means spending at least 40% of our documentation time in formatting. Let's say tech writers, in this case, become part of a pagination department for SMEs. In the production phase, we write once but can reuse in multiple contexts. Also, we translate once, and DITA doesn't allow the translation agency to charge any formatting costs for the translated content. When updating source content, you provide only the updated content to the translation team. In the distribution phase, let's say in the publication phase, we have a massive potential for reuse in multiple formats, from PDF to PowerPoint to video script and to chatbot messages, and on multiple devices. And finally, with DITA, let's remember that updates are 100% accurate and extremely quick to implement. A single click is enough. Now, let's get practical. Let's take the example of the fact sheet. Next slide, please. Let's examine a real case with a high potential of reuse in the production phase. The product is the Wurst machine designed in Europe and exported globally. First, in the preparation phase, we can reuse the fact sheet format, typography, illustration, layout. In the production phase, we are talking about reusing content of similar products. Reuse potential includes the product title, text portions that show 90% of similarity, but that can be reused at a 100% level. The difference of 10% is due to the author's lack of attention to details, grammar and typography. For example, in the LPG 209 version, the sentence linking and transfer to hanging or separating is incomplete. Whereas in the LPG 208 version, it is almost correct. The same with polyamide or cellulose casing in the LPG 208 version, which is spelled correctly in the LPG 209 version. Designing the content, ensuring it is accurate once and reusing it in multiple occurrences not only reduces copy and paste costs, but increases consistency and quality. Let's go further and examine other reuse opportunities and benefits. Next slide, please. Here we have further reuse options within our fact sheets. Because DITA topics can be managed via meta tags, we can adapt our content to a specific audience. This fact sheet should be customized for an English-speaking audience, but also for English-speaking countries that don't use the metric system. In this example, we'll focus on presenting figures in different countries. We'd better decide once how to type 1.200 portions per minute, or is it 1,200 cuts per minute? Also, we could check the correct way to represent 3.000 sausages per minute in Europe and in the US. Is it an output of 3.0 sausages or 3,000 sausages per minute? Well, the usage of the period should be clarified. Here again, reuse could reduce ambiguities and ensure 100% accuracy, we are talking about 2.5 seconds, which is correct. But what is a 1.440 millimeter sausage? Next slide, please. Measurement units, either imperial or metric, have always been a pain on international level. Is it a comma, a period, a space? So many different standards. That's why we should standardize our layout and typography and reuse it. Next slide, please. Another example of lack of accuracy for the same type of document that can be solved by applying DITA topic content reuse is phone numbers. Think of a customer based in Saskatchewan seeking some information about the Wurst machine A. Which number should he dial? 49 followed by 0 or not? Now let's imagine how we could reuse this piece of information in various documents in multiple formats. Next slide, please. Okay. Presenting these phone numbers might be really trivial to you, but it's so important because it is going to be displayed in all documents, in all PDF publication, for example, and therefore it is worth unifying the layout. It's really a matter of customer experience. If the prospect can't reach you, he'll never become a customer. And you may want to insist on this point, since your CEO just hired a customer experience manager. Next slide, please. We are also presenting all the phone numbers in electronic format. They will be reused in web pages, training documentation, and also in a chatbot conversation. For example, when answering a question such as, how do I contact company XYZ in Germany? Don't forget to reuse these numbers in your sales or training videos. Next slide, please. Let's go beyond plain content reuse and think about updating the information. Let's say we skip the word phone and replace it with a short form TEL. DITA allows us to replace the term once and have all the occurrences updated in one click. Next slide, please. Now, let's recap. We have been talking about the 4 phases of reuse. And our boss is almost convinced that we are on the right track. He appreciated our fact sheet example. And we explain content reuse between machine A and machine B, whereas the measurement units and phone number reuse were applied to every piece of information and for all products throughout the organization. We also demonstrated that not only can we reuse content and therefore save efforts and money, but also increase the quality of information. Next slide, please. Now it's time to engage all stakeholders in the project with the objective to collect all their documentation needs. We are going to invite pre-sales, post-sales group. Both of them are probably working in silos. It's a good opportunity now to have them at the same table and demonstrate how DITA can both manage their requirements and save documentation costs. By the way, don't forget to invite your customer experience expert. Next slide, please. The marketing department is asking for both paper documentation and online documents. Note their demand for RFP, request for proposal. Proposal writers have a huge need for reused content. No surprise about the international operation requirements. Documentation must be available in the customer language. Next slide, please. We go on with collecting documentation requirements. For the post-sales, we have a huge need for paper documentation and in particular, huge manuals. We also have requirements for troubleshooting guide. Don't forget troubleshooting, because usually our end user opens the manual only when they have a trouble. We should also think of short videos. Nowadays, short videos are in high demand. They belong to our job as information architect, and we should not miss the opportunity to illustrate our multiple skills. These videos for the operation department these are of how-to type. We are smart information developers, and that's why we are going to prioritize the troubleshooting guide. Of course, international department requires documentation in several languages. Next slide, please. The training department needs, of course, coursebook in PDF format. And of course, PowerPoint documentation. They also need quiz, because nowadays there is no training without quiz. It's better for the attention of the attendees. We are having lots of discussion because, for example, the quiz should be based on the procedures in the operator's guide and in the troubleshooting guide. This means we can reuse these procedures. And of course, organizations are now acknowledging the importance of customer experience. Technical writers should provide their input at each customer touchpoint, such as Twitter messages, chatbots, or even Facebook. Next slide, please. Now, time has come to collect all the requirements, the documentation requirements. And we can collect it in a single table. Of course, the marketing department has a lot of requirements for paper and online. We should not forget the requirements coming from the legal department. There is a huge demand for legal content in several formats. This is a high potential for reuse. Think of warranties, trademarks, and these inevitable warning messages. Next slide, please. Here we have the list of requirements for the training department, the hotline, and the customer experience team. Note the training quiz requirement for an HTML5 mobile compatible format. Trainees want to test their know-how anytime on any device. To be ready to answer all customer inquiries and problems, the hotline needs all kinds of documentation. In particular, the list of error messages and the pertaining solution. Next slide, please. Because the organization wants to increase its market share at the international level, there is an urgent need for localized documentation in multiple outputs, including HTML5, video, chatbot, Twitter, and slides. Remember, the content will be translated once and reused in all formats for similar machines. Next slide, please. Now let's sum up all the requirements for a single Wurst machine. In each delivery format, as a CFO, the Chief Financial Officer, joins the meeting, there is a problem. He is close to collapse. 56 documents for a single machine type is far above his documentation budget. Next slide, please. Oh, there is one slide. Can you go one slide back? Okay. Yes, here we have the 56 documentation for the machine. Sorry, the next slide, it's about reusing a topic. Let's keep calm and show what DITA can do for the organization and for the CFO. With DITA, we are no longer thinking in documents, but in topics. Topics will be reused without any modification in numerous outputs. For example, this troubleshooting topic, written once. Next slide, please. And reuse 8 times for a single machine and a single language, and responding to the documentation needs of 4 departments. Note the possibility to reuse the topic as a script for a debugging video. Further, Twitter accepting now 260 characters is a convenient channel to disseminate troubleshooting messages to your customers. And of course, you can reuse a troubleshooting topic as a quiz question. What to do when process stopped and power on is displayed. DITA developers don't write 56 documents. They write once and reuse it 56 times. Next slide, please. Pardon. This is a plain task topic for producing vegan sausages. We reuse in one language, changing step 3 only. We can reuse it for different sausages: mutton merguez, Cajun, Frankfurter, and British bangers. Then we can reuse each version of the topic, that is for merguez, Cajun, Frankfurter, and so forth, in multiple outputs. Next slide, please. First, we are focusing on the vegan sausage procedure only. We'll reuse it in the operation guide in PDF format, in HTML5 on mobile, in a video script, in a chatbot conversation, and of course, in a quiz. This single topic is reused 10 times in a single language for a single machine and a single product, the vegan sausage. Now let's figure out the reuse potential for mutton merguez, Frankfurter, British bangers, and Cajun sausages, because you simply need to modify step 3 of the procedure to adapt it to each sausage type, and reuse it another 10 times for the same product. This means reusing without rewriting or reformatting. Next slide, please. Let's recap. We have prepared the stakeholders meeting. We evaluate the reuse potential. We'll collect each department documentation needs and share it with all stakeholders, including the chief financial officer. Showing the reuse techniques for 2 topics reassures them about the feasibility and the benefits of moving to DITA. While stakeholders are enjoying their coffee break and thinking of new documentation needs, we'll check our figures about cost savings. Next slide, please. let's base our cost-saving evaluation on the current figures. Here, an example from the UK. If you don't have, next slide, please. If you don't have your own figures, let's see some other estimates. Basic figures, just to get started. How do these 5 hours per page for his user guide sound to you? For my part, I would say it depends if it's a completely new product or if it's something the technical author is familiar with. Next slide, please. After defining the current cost of the documentation, we can start playing with the reuse figures. Our colleague, Jackie Samuels from Canada, provides us with hints on how to measure reuse when authoring in DITA. Note Bill Hacker's method of analyzing the number of words in context. Don't hesitate to stress the high figures reached in real life. Next slide, please. What about taking a small poll? Adam, will you please, here we are. How far can we go in content reuse? Do you think 90% is too much? It's not feasible.
With about 60% of the attendees voting, right now we have 38% saying 20% of reuse is possible, 30%, 32% of 90% reuse, and 32% of 34% of 70% reuse. That's with, I'll give it a couple more seconds. We have the majority of the attendees voting, and I am going to close it right now. And the final votes were 39% saying 70% reuse, 32% saying 20% reuse, and 29% saying 90% reuse.
Okay, well, our colleague Jackie Samuels has quoted the figure of 588% reuse for Xerox. And we heard of different colleagues thinking of 90% content reuse. Next slide, please. Expert Mark Lewis talks about 63% of cost savings at the publication level only. This is based on topic reuse. Next slide, please. And of course, 30% for all different versions of a single user guide. He's also talking of 70% of average reuse within each topic. Next slide, please. Here we have an example of savings based on hours spent to write topics for one product, the vegan sausage, for example, and reuse for 2 other products, the Frankfurter and the Cajun sausages. We write the topic for the vegan sausage once. Then we write only the content that is unique to Frankfurter and Cajun. In our case, this was step 3 of the procedure. This means the effort is 100% for the vegan sausage, but only marginal for unique content. Next slide, please. In the translation phase, we are also registering savings of about 60 hours for 3 products and 300 topics. The estimation is based on words and hours, because in Europe we evaluate translation per word. At that stage, the manager for international operation is smiling. Next slide, please. These wonderful figures are going to please the CFO. It's another example based on costs per page. For ST Microelectronics, Stylo estimated a cost per page of $65.50 US, and a cost saving potential of 170,000 pages of about $2 million US per year. The CFO is smiling too. These savings leaves enough budget to invite Mrs. DITA von Thies for dinner. Next slide, please. In other words, DITA means huge cost savings, process improvement, automation via reuse, reduce risks. So, what's next? Yes, you made it. The management approved your migration project. Apart from opening the champagne bottle, you can now start thinking about designing a small pilot project. Don't start big. Try to think about reuse opportunities of few tasks and reference topics, for example, with illustration, and of course, consider the translation. Next slide, please. At this stage, it doesn't hurt to provide some additional information to your management in case they missed the point. For example, we have Introduction to DITA, designed by Hewlett-Packard. It's very short and it will please your management. And another short video explaining why DITA is important. Your team will for sure be interested in these articles and videos. I think it might be interesting for them to understand exactly what is content reuse. The article by Michael Priestley is fundamental. You should have it in your on your desk and have all your team members read it. Next slide, please. It might also be interesting to consider the reuse metrics, an article written by Bill Hackos, and a webinar designed by Anne Rockley. And of course, is something interesting, a webinar by Lee White about the elusive promise of content reuse, which stresses the problems when the team has not been trained in writing topic-based documentation. And of course, when it comes to estimating cost savings, next slide, please. You can check these excellent resources, including a LinkedIn discussion group. Next slide, please. There are several other resources which are easily accessible. This article by Marie-Louise, and of course, this small book, very handy and easily understandable about DITA metrics. Next slide, please. You can also have access to a ROI calculator for a CMS. It might be also interesting for your project to convince your management how useful and smart it is to switch to DITA. Next slide, please. Thanks to everyone who helped me make this webinar. It's an international team. And next slide, please. Thanks to you for your attention. Of course, you can send me all comments and complaints to the above mentioned addresses. And of course, you can send me Twitter messages. I'm more or less addicted to Twitter. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Marie-Louise. A very informative webinar. Yes, we do have several questions that come in. The first one, bear with me. The first one has come in is reuse for video possible?
Oh, I probably didn't mention it correctly. Reuse for video, what I mean is using a procedure as a script to start your video. Technically, I'm not sure you can reuse the video itself, but for the start, you're not going to launch designing a video from scratch. You have to have some script, some scenario to get started. Define exactly what you want to explain in the video. And this is the point where I say, don't start reinventing the wheel. Start with the existing procedure. This will be the steps of your video. This is what I mean by reusing the content of the topic for designing a video.
Great. Thank you, Marie-Louise. The next question is kind of long, so please bear with me. The question is, some team members are really happy with MS Word because they can modify and format it the way they want. They cannot do that with a PDF. What would our argument be to sell DITA to them?
Because I'm not sure they enjoy formatting in Word, spending time just fighting with the Word bugs. It's not very productive, and you have to be extremely patient to work with Word because sometimes you have surprises. So I would suggest to colleagues who are working with Word to switch a little bit their mentality and spend more time designing the content and not spending hours with the heading format and all that sort of things. Let's say it's more fun to focus on the end user's need and to write for him and to write correctly. And let's say to spend time with a terminology database instead of losing time formatting in Word. because we do need consistent terminology. Or if it's not a terminology database, it could be a style guide, which is very important in our case. So I think we just should forget about Word and modifying Word templates.
Great. Thank you, Marie-Louise. We have a couple more questions. We have a couple more questions come in. The next one is, you mentioned knowledge bases at one point. What's the best way to integrate DITA and a KB?
Well, if we write small pieces, because DITA is made of topics, we can write very short topics, don't we? This kind of information can be reused in a knowledge base. Of course, now I would like to ask all our colleagues and experts on taxonomy how they want to manage that. But for sure, you can reuse this part of some, let's say, task, and even you can reuse some part of a concept in your knowledge base. In particular, if you don't write huge pieces of information, you don't write any block of information when you are doing DITA. So these pieces can be reused and adapted in a knowledge base.
Great, thank you. The next question has come in is, why do DITA projects fail?
Of course, it's because of the machine, it's because of DITA, or let's say, actually, several colleagues have already presented about DITA failures or problems. Well, usually I would say it's because teams, and I'm speaking about the experience in Europe, teams choose to do it alone. They don't ask experts for advice. They don't attend conferences. They don't listen to webinars. And they don't spend time preparing their project. And of course, they don't dare to ask for a budget. And because of this very poor preparation phase, usually the DITA project fails. I think they should spend time on analyzing the needs, their needs for documentation. And they don't make any survey of their legacy documentation. Some of them prefer to just migrate their content one-to-one. And I think it's not the right way to do it. They should clean their content well before they migrate, and they will discover that their content should be cleaned and made DITA compatible.
Great, thank you, Marie.
You are welcome.
And the last question that has come in is, what do you think of documentation quality? What do you mean by the quality in TechCom?
I know a lot of colleagues consider quality of documentation if the layout is very clean, if the author didn't forget to add a comma or a period, and if the illustrations are wonderful and if the margins are perfect. I don't think the end user is interested in the margins, nor in the size of, in the font size. The end user, because we are writing for end users, the end user is interested in finding the information he's looking for in the manual within minutes or within seconds. If my end user finds the answer to his problem within minutes, I must say I did a good job. This is the only point for me to consider quality.
Great. Thank you, Marie-Louise, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. This will conclude today's broadcast. You will be able to access the recorded version of this webinar in the archive section, in the webinar archive section of our website, located at www.dclab.com. Our next webinar will be Tuesday, January 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, titled "Automate to Stay Up to Date: 5 Ways to Maintain Your Training Content," being presented by Amber Swope, DITA Specialist at DITA Strategies. Thank you again, everyone, for attending, and have a great day.
Thank you. Goodbye.